Good morning, this is Omni View, Episode 9, Balanced News Perspectives. Today is March 8th, 2026. We'll cover what happened, how different viewpoints frame it, so you can decide for yourself. U.S. and Israeli strikes ignite oil depots in Tehran, escalating the Middle East war into its second week. Let's dive right into that lead story. According to reports from Mail Online and France 24, U.S. and Israeli forces have targeted military and oil infrastructure across Iran, leading to massive fires spreading through Tehran's streets and oil depots. This comes amid the ongoing Middle East conflict now entering its second week, with the strikes apparently aimed at weakening Iran's regime in the face of broader regional tensions. What's interesting here is how coverage from various outlets highlights the intensity of the assault. Some, like those aligned with U.S. and Israeli perspectives, frame it as a necessary response to Iranian aggression that could speed up regime change, emphasizing strategic gains. On the other hand, international voices, including those in France 24, stress the humanitarian fallout such as civilian risks and the potential for wider instability, portraying the moves as a dangerous provocation that might draw in more global powers. Conservative-leaning reports underscore President Trump's readiness to deploy ground troops if needed, while progressive or international outlets express concern over fears of nuclear escalation. The question nobody's asking enough is, what evidence supports claims that these strikes are targeting only military sites versus civilian infrastructure, and how might that distinction hold up under scrutiny? Shifting now to a related development inside Iran itself, France 24 and Al Jazeera report that Iran's Assembly of Experts has announced a consensus on a successor to the late Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, drawing from his prior advice, even as Israeli forces vow to target anyone involved in the appointment process. Street demonstrations are showing support for the Islamic Republic during this transition, though the selection is happening amid ongoing attacks. Some reports, particularly from Al Jazeera, portray this as a stabilizing move, emphasizing public chants of support and noting that the process had no involvement from the military's IRGC, which could signal a push for continuity. In contrast, outlets like The Guardian highlight external threats, viewing Israeli warnings as aggressive overreach that might prolong the war, while framing the new leader as a potential escalation point due to being a figure hated by adversaries. International coverage often balances optimism for regime continuity with concerns about how this could fuel further strikes or internal divisions, especially since Iran has rejected U.S. demands for surrender as unrealistic. A thoughtful question to consider: how reliable are these reports of public support versus the possibility of coercion, and what does that say about the true state of sentiment on the ground? Meanwhile, the conflict is spilling over, with Iranian counterstrikes hitting Gulf infrastructure. CNBC and The Guardian detail how Iranian projectiles have continued targeting civilian sites in Bahrain, the UAE, and Kuwait, including a drone attack in Dubai that killed one person and set skyscrapers ablaze, following earlier hits on Dubai's airport. A tower in Kuwait City was also engulfed in flames as part of this broader retaliation. Business-focused coverage, like from CNBC, stresses the economic disruption to Gulf infrastructure, seeing it as a threat to regional stability and oil flows that could have ripple effects globally. International reports, such as in The Guardian, highlight civilian casualties and frame these as desperate measures by a beleaguered Iran, contrasting with U.S. and Israeli perspectives that justify their own strikes as defensive responses to such aggression. Some outlets weave in the potential for this tit-for-tat violence to involve more countries, balancing views of it as evidence of escalating conflict with calls for ceasefires. Here's a question worth pondering. Are these strikes primarily military in nature or deliberately aimed at economic targets, and how might that intent shape international alliances in the region? Staying with the U.S. role in this escalating situation, Mail Online and The Guardian note that President Trump has indicated American ground troops are prepared for deployment in Iran and is considering operations to seize nuclear stockpiles, amid fears of uranium falling into unintended hands. Iran has firmly rejected demands for unconditional surrender. U.S.-centric reports present Trump's stance as a strong deterrent against nuclear threats, emphasizing his shift from a peace president image to more aggressive action, which some see as essential to prevent catastrophe. International views, however, criticize it as reckless escalation that overlooks diplomatic paths, with outlets like The Guardian pointing to allied tensions, such as UK criticisms of Trump's social media diplomacy. Discussions often highlight how these potential missions could be overambitious, contrasting support for decisive moves with warnings of broader fallout and prolonged war. One key question this raises: what constitutes the very good reason that might justify ground troop deployment, and how accurate are the assessments of Iran's nuclear risks driving these considerations? Next, a story that might or might not tie into these global tensions: an explosion at the U.S. Embassy in Oslo. Newsmax reports that an explosion occurred early this morning at the embassy, causing minor material damage, but thankfully no injuries, with the cause still unknown and police investigating. Coverage varies, with some outlets speculating on possible links to the Middle East war, portraying it as a potential security lapse amid heightened global alerts and broader instability affecting diplomatic sites. Others treat it as an isolated event, possibly unrelated to international conflicts, emphasizing the lack of casualties as a point of relief. International reports balance immediate facts with uncertainty about implications, weaving in calls for vigilance without jumping to assumptions about motives. A question to keep in mind: could this be connected to the Middle East conflict, or is it something entirely unrelated, and how should authorities go about verifying the cause without fueling unnecessary speculation? Turning to another angle of the Middle East conflict, this time in Lebanon. France 24 and Mail Online describe how Israeli missiles struck a seaside hotel in central Beirut, targeting Iranian Revolutionary Guards based there as part of ongoing operations in the region. Iran's guards have warned they could sustain fighting for up to 6 months. Reports from diverse sources depict this as a precise hit on military targets to disrupt Iranian influence, with some praising it as effective counterterrorism and a step toward creating conditions for regime change in Iran. Others, however, highlight the risks to civilian areas in a populated city like Beirut, framing Netanyahu's strategy as ambitious regime-overthrowing moves versus purely defensive necessities. International coverage balances Israeli claims with Iranian narratives of resilience, noting the potential for this to draw Lebanon deeper into the conflict and concerns over prolonged warfare. What's intriguing here is the question: were civilians adequately protected during the strike? And how might the answer affect Lebanon's overall stability in this volatile mix? On the diplomatic front, tensions are also rising between allies. Mail Online reports that UK Foreign Secretary Cooper has mocked President Trump's diplomacy through social media after Trump criticized Prime Minister Starmer's lack of support, warning that the US would remember the frayed special relationship, while Cooper called for a calmer approach. British outlets frame this exchange as straining historic alliances, portraying Trump's online attacks as impulsive amid war pressures and Cooper's response as a push for measured diplomacy. From a U.S. perspective, it might be seen as justified frustration over insufficient allied backing, while international reports highlight it as evidence of transatlantic divides exacerbated by the conflict. Discussions often blend concerns about weakened cooperation with hopes that cooler heads could restore ties, contrasting fiery rhetoric with calls for unity. A thoughtful point to consider: does social media diplomacy help or hinder international relations, especially in high-stakes situations like this? Before we go, tomorrow, watch for updates on Britain's gas supply fears tied to the Middle East conflict, as concerns over disruptions could intensify if the war affects energy routes further. That's Omni View. For full source links and more context, check out today's written briefing on the OmniView Summaries page. As always, compare outlets, look for primary documents, and separate what's known from what's assumed. If balanced perspectives are valuable to you, share this with a friend and subscribe wherever you listen. See you tomorrow.
Without taking the dive, we went on vacation. We had a nice time. My doomsday is set.